On the morning of March 15, 1944, at 25,000 feet above Berlin, Captain William Overstreet from North Carolina felt the bitter cold pushing through the thin shell of his P-51 Mustang as the outside temperature hovered around 65 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, which was cold enough to freeze bare skin in half a minute. His aircraft shook violently as another stream of cannon fire ripped past the right wing, missing by barely 3 feet. The German pilot chasing him in a Messerschmitt 109 was skilled, perhaps the best Overstreet had encountered in 8 months of air combat, but the German had not yet discovered the new secret Overstreet carried. His Mustang was fully loaded with armor-piercing incendiary ammunition that would soon reshape the deadly dance of the air war. 6 months earlier, American bomber crews had been dying in numbers that horrified commanders in Washington. On some missions, nearly 1/3 of the crews were lost. A mathematics teacher from Ohio, then assigned to the 8th Air Force headquarters, calculated that the United States would run out of trained bomber crews long before they ran out of targets. The B-17 flying fortresses entered German airspace at about 160 miles per hour, slow enough to make them easy marks for Luftwaffe fighters that could climb and attack at nearly double that speed. German fighter pilots had perfected a cruelly efficient technique. They approached the bombers from straight ahead at 12 o'clock high-firing explosive cannon shells directly into the cockpit, then watched the giant aircraft roll over and fall with 10 young men inside helpless. By late 1943, the German aces were confident to the point of arrogance. At airfields in France and Holland, they gathered before missions drinking real coffee, while American crews settled for powdered substitutes that tasted like burned earth. They laughed about the shortcomings of the American escort fighters, especially the P-47 Thunderbolts that could fly only about 300 miles into Europe, before running low on fuel, forcing them to turn back and leaving 600 miles of German-controlled territory, where Luftwaffe could freely attack the bomber formations. At several German fighter bases, the tallies painted on aircraft fuselages looked like impossible scoreboards. Major Hans Kirstner from Munich carried 43 bomber kills on his Messerschmitt. He had developed a method he trusted completely. He ignored the bomber's defensive guns and aimed every burst straight at the cockpit. He believed the price of a few bullet holes from returning fire was trivial compared to the devastating punch of his 20mm cannon shells, which cut basketball-sized gaps in the big American aircraft. He once told his wingmen over glasses of schnapps that fighting American bombers felt like hunting slow cattle that could not change course and died in droves. Everything began to shift when the first P-51 Mustangs arrived in England in December 1943. A mechanic from Detroit assigned to work on them at Leston Airfield studied the aircraft with disbelief because it was nothing like the other fighters he had serviced. It was graceful fast and built for the long reach of deep strike missions. Packed inside it was the British-designed Merlin engine, the same power plant used in the legendary Spitfire, which allowed the Mustang to reach more than 437 miles per hour. Even more importantly, the Mustang carried drop tanks that gave it a range of roughly 1,400 miles. For the first time, American bombers could receive fighter escort all the way to Berlin and back. Yet the true revolution came from the new ammunition. A standard .50 caliber round already traveled at nearly 2,800 feet per second and ripped through aluminum skin with ease. But the new armor-piercing incendiary rounds were far more destructive. A chemist from New Jersey who helped create the compound explained that these bullets would pierce armor, then burn at nearly 3,000 degrees for about 2 seconds. If they reached a fuel tank, even one designed to seal itself, the result was fire. If they struck an ammunition store, they caused explosion. If they hit a German bomber carrying thousands of pounds of explosives, the resulting fireball could be seen for miles. German pilots discovered the power of these rounds during Big Week, which began on February 20, 1944, when the United States launched a massive campaign to destroy German aircraft factories. Lieutenant James Morrison from Texas escorted bombers over Leipzig when he spotted about 30 Junkers 88 bombers heading toward the American formation. The Germans were now using their own bombers as flying rocket platforms to break apart tightly packed bomber groups. Morrison led his Mustang flight downward with the sun behind them. His first burst of armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck the lead Junker's engine cowling. At first nothing happened, and then a sheet of flame erupted, expanding along the wing, as the intense chemical fire burned hotter than ordinary fuel could withstand. The German aircraft became a falling torch. Morrison watched 2 parachutes open, but the remaining crew perished. At 25,000 feet that day, the temperature sat near 58 below zero. Ice formed inside Morrison's oxygen mask. His fingers numbed despite his fleece-lined gloves. Still, he pressed his attack. Another burst ignited a second Junkers, which exploded when flames reached the bomb bay. The shock wave shook Morrison's Mustang nearly into his wingman, a young pilot from Nebraska, who narrowly avoided collision. The surviving German bombers panicked, scattering in every direction, jettisoning rockets, bombs, and anything else that added weight as they dove for safety. Even veteran Luftwaffe crews who had fought Spitfires and Soviet Yaks had never faced anything like the combined speed range and terrifying burning power of the Mustangs using armor-piercing incendiary rounds. When Major Kirstner heard the report from Leipzig, he sat in his ready room at his base near Munich, reading the details brought by his crew chief, a seasoned mechanic who had served since the Spanish Civil War. 15 bombers lost in 12 minutes, most of them burned rather than simply shot down. A burning aircraft meant no chance for survival at altitude because fire-consumed oxygen filled the fuselage with smoke-melted control wires and forced men to choose between burning alive or jumping from 20,000 feet without a parachute. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe had to rewrite its tactics, ordering pilots to avoid direct attacks and evade the Mustangs whenever possible. But Overstreet and others in his squadron adapted as well, learning to conserve fuel so effectively that some could reach Berlin and still fight for nearly an hour before turning home. The real trial came on March 6, 1944, when the United States launched its first major daylight assault on Berlin. More than 660 bombers pushed eastward with 800 fighters guarding them, and among those 174 P-51 Mustangs formed the long protective wall around the B-17 formations. Captain William Overstreet flew as Yellow 3 in the 357th Fighter Group, weaving above the topmost bomber boxes at 27,000 feet. The cold at that height reached nearly 62 degrees below zero, and a layer of ice clung to the Mustang wings, even though the de-icing system fought to keep them clear. Overstreet had already been in the air for 3 hours. His back hurt from the pressure of the parachute harness and the strong black coffee he drank at the briefing before dawn felt like a tight knot in his stomach. While scanning the southern sky, he spotted them. A full staffel of Messerschmitt 109s climbing fast, trying to position themselves above the bombers for a downward attack. There were 12 fighters, possibly from Jagdschwader 27, known for its skilled pilots. Overstreet radioed the sighting to his flight leader, then pushed the throttle forward. The Merlin engine surged, responding like a living thing as the Mustang climbed at nearly 3,000 feet per minute. Contrails streaked behind every aircraft like chalk lines drawn across a deep blue canvas. The merge came at 29,000 feet. Overstreet chose a 109 lining up on a damaged B-17 that lagged behind its squadron. He pulled ahead of the German fighter, estimating the angle the same way he had done while hunting ducks back in North Carolina. When he pressed the trigger, the 650 caliber guns on the wings roared. The convergence point had been set for 300 yards, and that was exactly where his stream of armor-piercing incendiary bullets met the German fuselage. The rounds punched through the area just behind the cockpit where the main fuel tank was mounted. The self-sealing system inside a German fuel tank could swell shut around ordinary bullet holes, but the incendiary compounds burned through rubber and metal alike, then kept burning as they fused into the high-octane fuel. The 109 erupted into flame so fast that Overstreet almost missed the moment of ignition. Fire traveled along the spine of the aircraft, and the pilot bailed out immediately. His parachute opened dangerously close to the burning fighter, and the white silk carried scorch marks from the heat before he drifted away. Another enemy fighter came down on Overstreet from the 7 o'clock position, and cannon rounds flashed past his canopy. He yanked the Mustang left, pulling so many GS that the world narrowed into a dark tunnel. His pressure suit tightened around his legs and abdomen, forcing blood into his upper body, and the gray fog lifted. The German pilot who had overshot the turn now hung directly in front of Overstreet. Overstreet fired a full burst and the tracers walked across the enemy fuselage. The engine exploded, hurling metal and shreds of cowling backward. The fighter stalled and plunged headfirst toward the earth. He did not see a parachute rise behind it. The air battle now spread across an enormous volume of sky, like a city of aircraft stretching for miles in every direction. The horizon curved visibly at that altitude, revealing the smoke from Berlin rising far to the east. The bomber stream itself looked like an endless chain of silver beads stretching back toward England. Overstreet barely had time to breathe before another 109 dove from 12 o'clock high. This pilot flew with the precision of a seasoned expert, weaving unpredictably so no defensive burst could get a clean lock on him. Overstreet fired sporadically, hoping to break the attack. Cannon fire from the German fighter tore into the Mustang. One shell ripped a fist-sized hole through the left wing. Another burst smashed into his drop tank, which thankfully was already empty. The tank fell away, making the Mustang lighter and quicker. The two fighters tore past one another at a combined speed of nearly 800 miles per hour, close enough for Overstreet to glimpse the enemy pilot's goggles and the pale flash of blonde hair. Both rolled skyward, then curved back in vertical turns, trying to maneuver behind the other. This was the purest form of energy combat, where altitude, speed, and timing determined who lived and who did not. The German pilot made a small error. He pulled too sharply and his aircraft shuddered into a momentary stall. Overstreet reacted instantly. He rolled upside down and pulled the nose of the Mustang through a tight arc, bringing the guns into a 90-degree deflection shot, one of the most difficult shots in air combat. He fired all 6 guns. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds traced long bright lines across the sky, converging on the cockpit of the 109. Brilliant white sparks bloomed as the rounds ignited. Fire burst from the fuel tank. The cockpit glass shattered outward. The German fighter rolled over, burning uncontrollably, leaving a twisting black trail until it disappeared beneath the clouds. Overstreet still had only seconds of ammunition remaining, and he estimated about 90 minutes of fuel left for the long flight home. His left hand, cramped from gripping the throttle, and frost glazed the edges of his oxygen mask. Yet the bomber formations pressed onward toward the German capital, and more enemy fighters were rising to meet them. The lead pilot of Overstreet's squadron, a comm teacher from Massachusetts, called out a new threat. Another formation of fighters, this time Focke-Wulf 190 aircraft climbing from the right. These fighters were fast roll, capable, and heavily armed. They often relied on brief slashing attacks before diving away. Overstreet inverted his Mustang and followed one that had botched an attack run on a bomber. The 2 aircraft plunged downward in a near-vertical dive. The airspeed needle slid past 400, then 450, then approached 500 miles per hour. Control surfaces on both aircraft stiffened under the pressure. The ground surged upward. At around 10,000 feet, the German pilot tried to pull out, but the 190 did not respond. It had waited too long. Overstreet began his own pull out higher at 12,000 feet. His body endured nearly 9 GS, and for 2 seconds his vision vanished. He trusted his training and held the controls steady until the Mustang leveled out at 8,000 feet. Behind him, a towering black column marked the impact point of the German fighter, smashed into the earth at incredible speed. Above him, the mission raged on, and the bombers continued toward Berlin, determined to finish what they had started. When Overstreet finally leveled his Mustang at 8,000 feet after the blackout, he took in the chaos unfolding around him. The air vibrated with radio calls, bomber crews reporting attacks, pilots shouting warnings, wingmen checking in or not checking in, and everywhere drifting trails of smoke-marked aircraft that had fallen from the sky. A B-17 to his right suddenly vanished in a violent flash as cannon fire from above struck its bomb bay. The 11-ton bomber shattered in midair, splitting apart in a burst of fire and debris. Overstreet counted only 3 parachutes drifting away and knew that 7 other men had never made it out. He pushed his Mustang upward again toward the main bomber stream, even though the engine had begun to run roughly after the strain of combat and the long dive. The cylinder head temperature needle hovered in the red zone, so he eased back the throttle, hoping to cool the engine while scanning his fuel gauges. He had about 600 miles to fly before touching down on English soil, and the remaining fuel looked dangerously low. As he climbed, he spotted a lone B-17, flying about 1,000 feet beneath the main formation. One propeller had been feathered, and another engine spewed thick smoke, leaving the bomber limping far behind the others. It was a perfect target for German fighters, and Overstreet knew they would find it. Sure enough, 2 Messerschmitt-109s appeared below him, setting up a classic rear attack on the bomber's vulnerable 6 o'clock position. Overstreet had perhaps 20 seconds of ammunition left, but he pushed into a steep dive anyway, trusting he could disrupt at least one attacker. The first German pilot never saw him coming. Overstreet fired a brief burst, and the glowing arcs of armor-piercing incendiary rounds traced upward into the 109's engine. The incendiary compounds ignited instantly, and white flame burst from the engine compartment, spreading down the fuselage. The German attempted to climb but stalled, and the fighter toppled sideways. Overstreet saw the pilot bail out just before the aircraft fell into a smoking spiral. The second German broke off his approach on the bomber and turned directly into Overstreet, firing his 20mm cannon as he came. A shell smashed into Overstreet's instrument panel, showering him with fragments of glass and metal. The artificial horizon went dead. The airspeed indicator froze at 300 miles per hour. Another fiery burst tore through the floor just inches from his boot, sending freezing air whistling into the cockpit. Overstreet pressed the trigger one last time, watching his final tracers arc toward the oncoming enemy fighter, but the rounds fell short. His guns clicked empty. He was wounded unarmed and still hundreds of miles from friendly territory. The German pilot appeared to realize this and slowed his approach until he flew beside the Mustang at a distance of perhaps 50 feet. For a moment, the 2 men regarded one another through their canopies. Overstreet, bleeding from cuts along his neck, met the German pilot's gaze. The German raised one gloved hand to his oxygen mask, as if offering a salute, then rolled away and descended toward his base, leaving Overstreet alive. The crippled B-17 managed to return to England, landing on an emergency strip along the coast, with 2 dead engines and more than 300 punctures riddling its fuselage. Overstreet landed shortly afterward at Leston, with fuel gauges reading empty and blood frozen across his cheek. His Mustang had taken 32 hits from machine guns and cannon shells. The base doctor removed 14 metal fragments from his neck and shoulder, while the crew chief examined the battered Mustang with disbelief. Despite the damage, the mission had succeeded. Berlin had been bombed, and the Luftwaffe had lost 43 fighters, most of them to the Mustangs and their incendiary ammunition. The German survivors returned to their bases, reporting the terrifying power of the new American rounds, describing aircraft that did not just fall but burned in midair. That evening, Major Hans Kirstner received word of the raid while sitting in his quarters writing letters to the families of pilots who would not be coming home. His own wingman, a young man only 20 years old who had flown beside him for 8 months, had burned alive when incendiary ammunition struck the fuel tank of his aircraft. Kirstner stared at the words on the page, unsure how to explain to a mother that her son had died engulfed in flame miles above the earth. The next morning, he attended a technical briefing where an officer explained what made the American ammunition so lethal. The rounds contained mixtures that burned at astonishing temperatures. Some used white phosphorus, which could burn underwater. Others used thermite, which reached nearly 4,000 degrees, capable of melting aluminum in seconds. These rounds did not simply puncture aircraft. They turned every hit into a fire that spread rapidly through oxygen lines, hydraulic systems, fuel lines, and ammunition stores. In January 1944, before the Mustang escorts began their deep penetration missions, the Luftwaffe had destroyed 5 American bombers for every German fighter lost. By April, with Mustangs guarding bombers all the way to the target, the ratio reversed. The Americans now shot down 3 German fighters for every bomber they lost. A mathematician at Luftwaffe headquarters calculated grimly that if losses continued at this rate, the German Air Force would run out of experienced pilots before summer ended. The psychological effect of the armor-piercing incendiary rounds proved even more devastating than their raw destructive power. German pilots who once attacked head-on without hesitation now approached cautiously, sometimes abandoning a run at the first hint of defensive fire. They had seen what happened when a single incendiary round reached a fuel tank or oxygen line. There was no time to bail out once the fire took hold. Flames spread too fast, smoke filled the cockpit, and melting control cables trapped pilots as their aircraft turned into falling furnaces. Some German pilots began wearing their parachutes unbuckled, ready to leap from their aircraft the instant they were hit. That hesitation often cost them the vital seconds needed to complete an attack run. On March 23, 1944, Lieutenant Charles Anderson from Missouri discovered a new advantage of the incendiary rounds during a mission to Frankfurt. He pursued a Messerschmitt 110 twin-engine night fighter that had been refitted for daylight interception. He lacked a clean shot at the fuselage, so he aimed for the left engine instead. His incendiary rounds tore through the nacelle, igniting hydraulic fluid. Fire shot along the wing like a burning fuse. The 110's landing gear dropped without warning, and its flaps extended fully as its hydraulic system failed completely. The aircraft became uncontrollable within seconds, and the crew bailed out. Anderson realized that even a glancing hit to a secondary system could cripple an aircraft entirely when incendiary compounds were involved. At Leston, the mechanic from Detroit who had fallen in love with the Mustang explained to new pilots in simple words why these rounds mattered so much. A normal bullet might damage an engine, he said, but an incendiary bullet melted the metal itself, warping valves, cracking blocks, and destroying tolerance. Even if the engine did not explode, it was finished. German pilots often thought they had escaped, only to have their engines seize minutes later, leaving them drifting helplessly downward. As April approached, the Luftwaffe issued urgent orders telling pilots to avoid Mustangs unless absolutely necessary, and to abandon any aircraft hit by incendiary fire. It was a stark admission that the sky had changed. The hunters had become the hunted. By the final week of March 1944, the effect of the incendiary ammunition had spread through every corner of the German Air Force. Pilots who once believed their machines could take punishment now lived with the knowledge that even a single strike could turn their aircraft into a burning tomb. In England, Captain Overstreet prepared for his next missions without fully realizing how much the balance of air power had shifted. His Mustang stood on the Harz, and dripping morning dew while his crew chief, a farm boy from Kansas, checked every bolt and cable. The mechanic from Detroit, who had once built engines at Ford, explained to the new arrivals what made the incendiary rounds so deadly. A normal bullet might pierce an engine block and cause a crack, but the armor-piercing incendiary compound burned so hot that it melted metal-warped steel and ruined the precision needed for an engine to function. Pilots often flew away thinking they had survived only to have the engine seize up minutes later, leaving them with nothing but a silent propeller and the long fall home. The Luftwaffe issued new directives that month. Avoid P-51 Mustangs unless the mission demanded it. Do not attempt turn fights. Make hit-and-run strikes only. Abandon aircraft immediately if incendiary rounds strike any critical system. This from the Air Force that had ruled European skies only a few years earlier. Overstreet flew his 25th mission on April 8, 1944, a milestone that should have sent him home to the United States for rest under normal circumstances. 25 missions meant you had done your duty and earned your return ticket. But the squadron was running out of experienced pilots, and replacements arrived with far less training. Overstreet volunteered for another tour. His crew chief called him out of his mind and reminded him that the Germans had incendiary ammunition as well, though theirs lacked the penetration and sustained burn of the American rounds. German 20mm mine shells exploded into thin-walled fragments that shredded aircraft, but they did not burn through metal like the American .50 caliber incendiary bullets did. The months proved the difference. In February, the 8th Air Force had lost more than 300 bombers. By May, the number dropped nearly in half because Mustangs escorted them every step of the way. Thousands of American airmen owed their lives to those long-range fighters and the ammunition that kept German attackers at bay. Early that spring, the American fighter groups changed tactics once the bombers were safely headed home. Mustangs dropped low to the deck-hunting German aircraft on the ground. Airfields that had once bustled with activity now saw entire lines of Focke-Wulf 190 fighters reduced to burning skeletons. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore through parked aircraft, setting fuel lines on fire and causing ammunition to cook off in devastating secondary explosions. A German mechanic later recalled watching fire leap from plane to plane as if alive. On April 13, 1944, Lieutenant Robert Johnson from Oklahoma encountered firsthand the terrible power of the ammunition he carried. He strafed an airfield near Munich when flak burst beneath his right wing, sending shrapnel into the ammunition bay. One fragment pierced an armor-piercing incendiary round, igniting the compound inside the wing. Smoke poured from the gun ports as the explosive mixture burned its way along the ammunition belts. Johnson smelled the chemical fire even through his oxygen mask and knew he had seconds before the entire ammunition load detonated. He flipped his Mustang upside down, hoping gravity would starve the fire of oxygen, then squeezed the trigger holding it until the guns emptied. The remaining rounds streamed out in one continuous torrent. When the belts finally ran dry, the fire died away. Johnson limped back to base with a wing that looked like it had been eaten from the inside. Inspectors later determined the aircraft could never fly again. The incendiary chemicals had heated the metal beyond recovery. On April 24th, Major Hans Kirstner returned to combat after his earlier bailout. He took up a new Messerschmitt 109 and climbed with 7 others toward a bomber formation near Friedrichshafen. As they approached 30,000 feet, the Mustangs appeared above them, diving with ruthless precision. Kirstner tried to use the superior climb rate of the 109, but a Mustang followed him into the vertical. At the top of the climb, both aircraft momentarily hung motionless before Kirstner kicked the rudder to slip sideways. The Mustang pilot anticipated the move and fired. Kirstner heard the sharp clangs of bullets striking metal. A smell unlike anything he had experienced filled the cockpit, the harsh burning odor of incendiary chemicals. One hit must have pierced an oxygen line because the fire fed hungrily behind his seat. Without hesitation, Kirstner released the canopy and rolled out into space, letting the freezing slipstream snatch him from the cockpit. His parachute opened at 25,000 feet, where the air was so cold that ice formed instantly around his goggles. As he descended, he watched the air battle unfold above him. Another German fighter exploded in a burst of flame likely set off by incendiary ammunition. A Mustang streaked downward trailing smoke but remained airborne. Far in the distance, the bomber formation pressed on toward the target, unmoved by the frenzied combat around it. This was April 1944, with the invasion of France only weeks away, though Kirchner did not yet know it. What he did know was that the Luftwaffe was crumbling. Training programs could not keep up with the losses. New pilots arrived with 100 hours of flight time, at best often barely able to form up in combat. Against Mustangs flown by seasoned American pilots, they stood little chance, and damage that once might have forced a landing now meant immediate destruction if incendiary rounds ignited fuel or oxygen lines. By the end of April, Kirchner's squadron, that began the month with 16 fighters, had only 6 remaining, and just 3 were flyable. The rest lay burned on the ground, testimony to the destructive power unleashed by the armor-piercing incendiary rounds that the American fighters delivered with relentless precision. The sky that once belonged to the Luftwaffe now belonged to the Mustangs and the fire they carried. By early May 1944, the Luftwaffe was collapsing under the combined weight of relentless Allied bombing and the deadly precision of Mustang escorts armed with incendiary ammunition. Every day, fewer German fighters rose to oppose the bomber streams, and many that did were flown by replacements with barely enough experience to keep formation, much less challenge seasoned American pilots. Captain Overstreet learned this grim truth firsthand on May 12th during a mission over Frankfurt. He led a flight of 4 Mustangs escorting B-24 Liberators on a strike against vital oil refineries. As the bombers approached the target, massive black flak bursts filled the sky so thick that the air itself seemed to darken. Amid that chaos, a single Focke-Wulf 190 burst through the flak cloud, flying straight into the bomber group with the desperation of a man who understood how critical the target was. He aimed for a struggling B-24 that trailed behind its formation after losing an engine. Before Overstreet could intercept another 190 dropped from above targeting him. They were flying a coordinated attack, one drawing the escort away while the other closed in for the kill. Cannon shells ripped into Overstreet's tail, shearing off pieces of his rudder and sending the Mustang yawing violently left. He fought the controls trying to keep the aircraft steady, but every adjustment demanded painful pressure on the damaged rudder pedal. Still, he had his guns, and he refused to let the doomed B-24 fall without a fight. The first German was committed to his attack run, giving Overstreet a narrow window. He fired from an impossible 800 yards, trusting the flat trajectory of the 50 caliber rounds. The incendiary tracers glowed as they arced across the sky, barely appearing on target until gravity nudged them downward. Then they struck the tail of the 190. Instantly, bright white flame poured from the fuselage, racing forward toward the cockpit. The German pilot rolled, inverted, and bailed out, but he drifted downward toward the burning city of Frankfurt, where bombed neighborhoods smoldered at nearly 2,000 degrees. Overstreet did not want to think about his fate. The second German attacked again, and Overstreet barely kept his crippled Mustang out of the line of fire. He had only 300 rounds remaining, and his aircraft was fighting him every second. The bomber he had saved dropped into formation behind him, and its gunners trained their 50 caliber guns on the pursuer. Facing both a bomber and a Mustang, the German pilot broke off and dove away, vanishing into the rising clouds of smoke. The journey home was a test of endurance. The damaged rudder forced Overstreet to hold constant pressure on the pedals until his right leg cramped so hard that tears welled in his eyes. He flew slower than he wanted, using more fuel than he could spare. By his calculations, he would run dry 50 miles short of the English coast. Then he saw them, 3 Mustangs from another squadron limping home with their own battle damage. Without exchanging words, they formed on his wings, one on the left, one on the right, and one behind. If he had to bail out over the channel, they would mark his position. the quiet solidarity struck him harder than any cannon shell had. His father, a veteran of the Great War, had spoken once about the strange bond that forms between men who share danger. Overstreet felt it now more clearly than ever. The English coastline finally came into view. His engine sputtered on final approach, coughing, once then died completely. He glided down at 120 miles per hour with no flaps because the hydraulics had been destroyed. The Mustang rolled a long distance before stopping, and Overstreet sat motionless for several minutes until the trembling in his hands eased. His crew chief counted 43 holes in the aircraft. The rudder held on by only 2 mounts. Several armor-piercing incendiary rounds from German guns were embedded in the steel plate behind his seat, with their chemical compounds burned out. Had they struck a few inches higher, they would have ignited the main fuel tank. After that mission, the tempo increased. In June, preparations for a massive Allied invasion intensified, and Mustang pilots flew as many as 2 sorties each day. They patrolled far ahead of the ground forces, striking trains, trucks, caravans, and transports to slow German movement toward the Atlantic Wall. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds performed brutally well in this role. A locomotive hit by incendiary fire did not simply stall. It burned until the tracks warped under the heat. Fuel convoys became rolling firestorms. Ammunition trucks erupted into explosions that shredded everything around them. The French resistance reported that German units hesitated to move during daylight, because even a single Mustang could turn a convoy into a graveyard in seconds. Lieutenant Paul Thompson from Georgia understood the science of fire better than most because he had been a volunteer firefighter before joining the Air Corps. On a mission to Hamburg on May 25th, he used that knowledge to devastating effect. He found a flight line of Junkers 52 transports parked together. Instead of making multiple passes, he aimed his incendiary rounds at the upwind aircraft, knowing the wind would drive the flames across the row. 3 transports ignited immediately, becoming giant torches. Wind carried burning debris onto the next aircraft, and soon 12 transports burned in a line so bright that the flames were visible from 10,000 feet. The fire raged for 6 hours, consuming everything on the field. The Luftwaffe scrambled to respond. They built earthen revetments around parked aircraft, but incendiary bullets ricocheted off the banks and continued burning until they found a fuel line or oxygen hose. They dispersed aircraft across multiple fields, but that only meant that more locations suffered Mustang attacks. They applied camouflage paint to hide from strafing runs, but once a single aircraft ignited, the towering plume of smoke exposed the entire base. By the end of May, German airfields resembled graveyards. Burned aircraft lay scattered in blackened patches of earth. Mechanics worked with what little remained. Pilots flew whatever could be patched together. And every day, Mustangs fired more incendiary ammunition, turning German industry and air power into smoldering ruins. When June arrived, the pressure intensified so heavily that even seasoned German aces felt the weight. The sky belonged to the Mustangs and the fire they carried. By the first days of June 1944, the Luftwaffe had reached the point of collapse, and even hardened pilots like Major Hans Kirstner felt the weight of a war slipping out of their hands. Nothing they tried slowed the destruction brought by the Mustangs and the relentless fire of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. They scattered aircraft across distant fields, but the Mustangs simply struck more targets. They dug deep revetments around hangars, but incendiary rounds bounced from dirt walls, still burning until they found something flammable. They covered aircraft in camouflage nets, but once even one fighter caught fire, the rising pillar of smoke exposed the entire field like a beacon. Kirstner returned to combat in early June, but half the pilots under his command were barely trained boys with 50 hours in the cockpit. They struggled to hold formation in the cold, thin air, much less fight disciplined American squadrons. He watched one 19-year-old pull too hard in a panic and tear the wings off his Messerschmitt. The boy did not even scream before he fell. On June 5th, while the world held its breath for an invasion still cloaked in secrecy, Kirchner took 6 Messerschmitt 109s into the sky on an interception mission near Bremen. They climbed toward the bomber streams when Mustangs dropped from 5,000 feet above with the precision of hawks striking pigeons. Kirchner banked right under 7 times the force of gravity, feeling his vision fade as the world dimmed at the edges. A burning streak of armor-piercing incendiary rounds tore through the space he had occupied a second earlier so close that he felt the heat flash across the canopy. His wingman Mueller was not so lucky. The incendiary rounds stitched across his fuselage and found the oxygen system. A blast of chemical flame filled the cockpit, turning the inside of the aircraft into a torch. Kirchner saw the canopy blow clear. He saw Mueller struggle to climb out, but the slipstream held him trapped as his flight suit burned. The 109 rolled downward, still on fire, until it vanished into the clouds. Another replacement pilot froze in terror, flying straight and level as a Mustang eased behind him. A burst of incendiary fire blew away his tail, and the fighter fell end over end. A third pilot panicked and collided with his own wingman in a desperate attempt to escape. Both fighters exploded before they reached the ground. 90 seconds after the engagement began, 4 German fighters were gone, leaving Kirchner with only 1 surviving wingman. They dove into a cloud bank, running for their lives. The air force that had once dominated Europe now fled from the Mustangs because one moment of hesitation, or even a glancing hit from incendiary fire, meant a fiery death. The following dawn brought a new sound that shook every German base in northern France. Air raid sirens screamed not in scattered bursts, but everywhere at once. Kirchner ran outside as engines thundered overhead in waves. The invasion had begun. Thousands of Allied aircraft swarmed over Normandy. Every German airfield within 200 miles came under attack. Ground crews scattered for cover as Mustangs, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, Spitfires, and Typhoons strafed and bombed with relentless fury. Still, Kirchner's squadron received orders to attack the invasion fleet. 6 Messerschmitt 109s against 5,000 ships. It was madness, but they launched without hesitation. They never reached the coast. 20 miles out, a flight of Mustangs intercepted them. Incendiary rounds flashed like white sparks around Kirchner's canopy. A shell struck his instrument panel, and the burning compound ignited instantly. The metal itself began to burn, giving off foul smoke that filled the cockpit. His engine took another burst, and the incendiary compounds chewed through oil lines, fuel lines, and coolant hoses. The engine, seized with a shriek and fire, raced back toward the cockpit. Kirchner had 5 seconds, maybe less, before the fuel tank detonated. He did not remember pulling the handle. One moment he was in a furnace. The next he was falling through open air, tumbling, until the parachute jerked him upright so hard he felt his spine tear. Above him, his fighter exploded into fragments, glowing against the rising sun. He drifted downward into a wheat field where Canadian paratroopers captured him. A sergeant from Toronto looked at the distant columns of black smoke stretching across the horizon and told him, "Your air force is finished, Fritz. That burning smoke is your whole Luftwaffe going up in flames." The man was not far from the truth. By noon on D-Day, the Luftwaffe had lost more than 300 aircraft, most of them destroyed by fighters using incendiary rounds. Pilots who had survived years of combat died that morning, trapped in burning cockpits. Entire squadrons vanished. Captain Overstreet flew 3 missions on D-Day, spending 12 hours in the cockpit, escorting transports, strafing German positions, and hunting for fighters that rarely appeared. His back ached from the strain, and his eyes burned from staring through the gun sight. But the invasion succeeded in large part because the Luftwaffe could barely rise to oppose it. On the second mission, Overstreet destroyed a German ammunition train whose cars were loaded with shells meant for coastal defenses. His incendiary rounds ignited the train, and the resulting blast tore apart a quarter-mile of track. Secondary explosions continued for 20 minutes, sending fireballs into the sky. By late June, Mustangs struggled to find enemy fighters because the Luftwaffe had pulled back far from the front lines, hoping to preserve what few experienced pilots remained. When they did fight, it was a quick slash attack, then a dive for home, because no one wanted to risk catching a single incendiary round. but even when the Germans avoided combat, incendiary rounds still posed danger. During a strafing run near Paris on July 7th, Overstreet was hit by flak. A shell burst under his left wing, sending shrapnel into the ammunition bay. One fragment pierced an armor-piercing incendiary round, and the compound ignited. He smelled the acrid burn inside the wing, and immediately rolled the Mustang, inverted, firing all guns in one long burst to clear the ammunition. When the bay emptied, the fire died. Had he waited 2 seconds longer, the entire wing would have detonated, and the Mustang would have vanished in a single fiery blast. His wing returned to base scorched and warped beyond repair. The Mustang was written off. This was the reality of the summer air war. Incendiary ammunition did not simply wound, it consumed. It melted metal-weakened wings, destroyed engines, and turned cockpits into furnaces. And every pilot in the sky knew that one hit in the wrong place meant a fall toward Earth surrounded by fire. July turned into August 1944, and the Allied armies finally broke free of the tight hedgerows of Normandy, unleashing a rapid advance across France, while the P-51 Mustangs roamed ahead, destroying anything German that dared to move. Railroad yards that once bustled with troop trains became fields of twisted metal after incendiary rounds ignited fuel cars. Vehicle depots turned into blazing pits when Mustangs dove in low-spraying armor, piercing incendiary fire that devoured tanks, trucks, and supply convoys alike. An entire German armored division near Falaise found itself trapped in daylight under clear skies, and the fighter bombers tore through them with methodical precision. Fuel trucks struck by incendiary ammunition erupted into towers of fire that scorched every vehicle around them, blocking narrow roads with burning wreckage and leaving German troops in chaos. Meanwhile, Major Hans Kirstner, now a prisoner in England, watched these events unfold through the fragmented stories of captured pilots and intelligence briefings. He sat behind wire fences, hearing reports of German cities burning under massive air raids and of airfields reduced to gravel and ashes. He thought often about the boys he had commanded. Of the 60 pilots he had flown with in the past years, only 8 survived the war. The rest perished in cockpits that became coffins often set alight by incendiary rounds. Many died before they had a chance to understand the weapon that killed them. Some died even before completing their first missions. In conversations with American pilots assigned to guard the prisoner camp, Kirstner learned more about the training American airmen received. A young pilot from Arkansas told him how they had practiced shooting at old car bodies in the desert, watching how the incendiary compound spread through metal and fuel. They treated the ammunition not as simple bullets, but as a scientific tool, learning the precise points on an aircraft where fire would spread fastest. Fuel tanks, oxygen bottles, hydraulic reservoirs, oil coolers, any place where liquids could ignite. The pilot described it with calm detachment, as if discussing a classroom experiment, yet the results in combat had been nothing less than catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. By September, Overstreet himself had flown 73 missions, almost triple the original tour requirement. On September 10th over Cologne, his luck finally ran out. His squadron attacked a German radar installation when a flak burst struck his right wing. The first shell ripped away his aileron, sending the Mustang wobbling out of balance. A second blast slammed into his engine. The temperature gauge jumped to maximum, then the needle melted. Oil pressure fell to 0. Fire burst through the vents as the German incendiary compounds chewed through the engine block. The aluminum cowling itself ignited, fed by burning oil and fuel. Overstreet knew he had seconds before the entire aircraft turned into a fireball. He jettisoned the canopy, rolled the burning Mustang onto its back, and flung himself into space. The chute opened at 500 feet, violently enough to nearly dislocate his shoulders. He crashed into a field, breaking his ankle, and watched from the ground as his beloved Mustang slammed into a hillside and exploded into a wall of fire that set the surrounding trees ablaze. German soldiers captured him within minutes. One officer studying the shattered remains of the Mustang said in halting English, "Your incendiary ammunition, we know it well. It burns our aircraft, we burn yours." Everyone burns. This is the air war now. He spoke with neither hatred nor triumph, only exhaustion. Overstreet spent the remainder of the war in Stalag Luft 3. From the barbed wire compound, he watched contrails stretch across the sky, daily as bomber streams continued to pound Germany, escorted by Mustangs that no German fighter could challenge for long. He saw the guards grow thinner, quieter, and more resigned. New prisoners arrived telling stories of German fuel shortages of aircraft, abandoned for lack of parts, and of young German pilots shot down before learning their own instrument panels. He listened as men described cities burning under incendiary raids and airfields, littered with the charred frames of fighters destroyed by strafing runs. When victory finally came on May 8, 1945, Overstreet was liberated by British troops and flown home aboard a C-47 transport. Looking down through the small window, he saw a nation shattered. City after city bore the black scars of immense firestorms. At nearly every airfield, burned husks of aircraft still lay where they had crashed months earlier. Armor-piercing incendiary ammunition had left a mark not only on machines, but on the earth itself, scorching soil so deeply that plants would not grow for years. In North Carolina, Overstreet tried to return to the quiet life he had left behind. He married his high school sweetheart, raised children, and ran a hardware store. Yet he could not erase the memories of burning metal melting wires, the smell of aluminum turning to vapor, and the sight of enemy pilots trapped in cockpits engulfed in burning oxygen flames. The incendiary rounds saved countless Allied lives, yet they also inflicted some of the most horrific deaths in the war. Meanwhile, in Munich, Major Kirstner returned to what remained of his home. His apartment building no longer stood. His airfield resembled a lunar landscape of craters and charred wrecks. When he reunited with other surviving pilots, they discovered how few remained. Many had burned alive in their aircraft or succumbed later to wounds that no doctor could heal. In 1960, at an aviation conference in London, Kirstner and Overstreet met for the first time as veterans, not enemies. They shared whiskey and memories of the savage battles over Europe. They realized they had likely fought each other at least twice. They spoke of lost friends and burning aircraft and the strange silence that followed every dogfight. Overstreet asked whether the Germans understood the impact of the incendiary rounds. Kirstner answered softly, "The first time I saw a Junkers burn from your fire, I knew the war had changed. It stopped being about skill or maneuver. It became about who burned the other first. You had better ammunition, and more of it." Their conversation drifted through missions and memories, neither man able to silence the ghosts that accompanied them. They spoke not with hatred, but with the weary understanding of men who had survived a time when the sky itself had become a furnace. In the years that followed the war, the memories of those battles settled into the minds of the men who had survived them like ashes that never quite blew away. German pilots who once laughed at the sight of the Mustang eventually spoke of it with a quiet respect tinged with fear, because the aircraft and the incendiary ammunition it carried had altered not only the outcome of the air war but the psychology of combat itself. Historians later studied the numbers and saw the shift clearly. In 1943, before the widespread use of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, the average Luftwaffe pilot could expect to survive close to 15 missions. By mid-1944, when Mustangs firing incendiary ammunition filled the sky, that number dropped to 7. The ammunition did more than destroy metal. It destroyed experience. When a bomber or fighter burned in midair, there was often no time for escape, and that loss fell hardest on the veteran German pilots who had once carried the air war on their shoulders. A post or study revealed that incendiary rounds increased aircraft losses by nearly 40% compared to ordinary ammunition. More devastating still, they increased pilot fatalities by 60% because burning aircraft allowed little chance of survival. Engineers and officers in the decades after the war explained the effect in cold technical terms, yet the men who fought remembered it as something far more personal. They remembered the smell of burning oxygen lines the roar of chemical fire, and the way a single strike could turn a sky full of machinery and skill into a vision of falling stars, each one carrying a human being within. The mechanic from Detroit who had worked on Overstreet's Mustang returned to Ford after the war and helped design the Thunderbird. On his desk, he kept a spent armor-piercing incendiary round mounted on a small wooden base. When co-workers asked why he kept it, he answered that little bullet helped end the war. It burned through engines and wings and turned hunters into prey. It made German bombers and fighters fall like leaves in autumn. And though it saved lives and ended battles, he understood its darker side as well. Many veterans did. The combination of the P-51 Mustang and the incendiary ammunition created a weapon system unmatched in the European theater. The Mustang had the speed range and handling to dominate the sky, and the incendiary rounds ignited anything they touched. Together they burned through the backbone of the Luftwaffe, leaving only scattered remnants to oppose the bombers that marched deeper into Germany with each passing month. Years later, in 1970, Overstreet returned to France for a ceremony in a small village liberated by his squadron during the summer of 1944. The mayor, who had been a child during the war, led him to a field at the outskirts of town where a German fighter had crashed after being hit by incendiary rounds. The outline of the wreck still marked the earth. Grass grew in uneven patches around the scarred soil, but at the center nothing grew at all. Even 25 years later, the ground remained dead poisoned by the chemical compounds that had burned so deeply into the earth that nature itself refused to reclaim it. As Overstreet stood in that barren patch, his mind drifted to the memories he had tried to bury for decades. He remembered the times he smelled burning aircraft even through a closed canopy. He remembered the sight of fuel lines lit like fuses and wings turning molten as airplanes spiraled downward. He remembered German pilots bailing out into sheets of flame or unable to escape at all. The incendiary rounds had saved countless Allied airmen by neutralizing the Luftwaffe, but somewhere in the quiet hours of the night, he often wondered whether the cost of such a weapon could ever be measured. His son, born after the war, once asked him if he regretted anything about his service. Overstreet answered only after a very long pause. "I regret that war demands such terrible tools. Those rounds saved many lives, but they took lives too in the worst ways a man can imagine. Young men burned alive at 20,000 feet with no place to go but down. That stays with you. It never leaves. Decades passed, and the number of surviving Mustang pilots dwindled. The last man from Overstreet's squadron died in 2018 at the age of 96. At his funeral, his grandson read an entry from his wartime diary dated June 1944. It said, "The incendiary rounds have turned us into executioners instead of warriors. We do not fight the enemy anymore. We burn him. I have watched 17 German aircraft burn this month. 17 crews. Boys like us dying in a way no one deserves. We are winning. But I wonder what it will cost our souls." That cost appeared different depending on who measured it. To the bomber crews who finally reached their targets and returned home because Mustangs cleared the skies, the incendiary rounds were salvation. To the German pilots who burned in their cockpits or fell in flaming parachutes, they were a nightmare from which there was no awakening. To commanders planning the air war, they were an equation. Fewer bombers lost meant faster victory and fewer casualties overall. William Overstreet passed away in 2013 at the age of 92. His obituary listed his 89 combat missions, his Distinguished Flying Cross, and his role in the liberation of Europe. It did not mention the nights he woke in silence with the smell of burning aluminum, lodged in memory, nor the faces of the men he had seen fall wrapped in fire. 3 years later, Hans Kirstner, the German pilot who had once fought him, died in 2016 at age 94. In his last years, he wrote extensively about the air war, trying to explain to younger generations what it meant to fight in a sky filled with burning aircraft and men who fell in trails of flame. When Overstreet was laid to rest, a bouquet of flowers was placed at his graveside, sent by an old German pilot who had become a friend long after the guns fell silent. The card read to a worthy opponent, "May peace find us all." It was signed Hans Kirstner. In the end, the P-51 Mustang entered history as one of the finest fighter aircraft ever built, while the incendiary rounds that fueled its deadliest victories became a footnote in textbooks. But to the men who lived through that terrible time, those bullets were unforgettable. They were the difference between victory and defeat, between living and dying, between making it home and burning in the cold, thin air at 25,000 feet. The German pilots had once mocked the Mustang, calling it a toy compared to their Messerschmitts. But by 1944, no one in the Luftwaffe was laughing. Their bombers, their fighters, their entire air force fell victim to the fire unleashed by armor-piercing incendiary rounds. It ended the war, faster saved countless Allied lives, and reshaped the balance of power in the sky. Yet it also left scars on the earth and in the hearts of the men who survived. In the end, no one truly won the fire. They only lived through it. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.